Hey guys, Louis Kirby here. Today, I want to take some time to dissect visual aesthetics. This may seem somewhat pretentious, but I think it's worth discussing, because most people discuss film in a very literary fashion, which makes sense because people are far more educated in literature than visual motifs. And I'm not saying a literary viewpoint isn't worth discussing, but I feel the visuals of the film, which is a more innate attribute of the work, isn't even considered when most people watch a film. If you're a major film enthusiast or filmmaker, you're probably pretty familiar with this form of thinking. This video is more so for people just getting deeper into film. Also, I will be relating this discussion primarily to film, but it can be applied to any visual medium, such as paintings, photography, or even graphic novels. To begin with, film is obviously an emotional medium, so typically, when you watch a film for the first time, you're better off not overanalyzing it. Just take it as it is. But if you're deeply touched by a certain work and find yourself rewatching it, it might be interesting to think about the visuals on a deeper level. The term visuals is very broad and vague, so it's important to break it down and simplify it, which Bruce Bloch did brilliantly in his book, The Visual Story. He broke it down into 6 parts: space, line and shape, tone, color, movement, and rhythm. These are all aspects in which no filmmaker can ignore, and are integral to conveying their story. So if you look out for these aspects in films, you may find a deeper appreciation. Another important thing to mention is that very few visual techniques are universal across all films. For example, the color red isn't going to have the exact same meaning in every film. It's up to the people making the film to set the parameters and give it definition, usually through the use of repetition and assigning certain techniques and styles to specific locations and characters. Similar to how many movies will have specific music themes for certain characters and places. I'm going to separate this video into 6 parts, one for each aspect of the visual language. In this video, I'll purely be discussing space, more commonly referred to as blocking, and perhaps the most primal and immediate aspect of the visuals. When thinking about space, there's 3 main components to think about: the position of the camera, the position of the subject, and the actual frame of the film. The position of the camera is pretty simple, yet extraordinarily powerful. There's some simple techniques, such as placing the camera low and looking up to make the subject huge, or have the camera look down to make them look small. But you can go deeper with it using perspective. There are 4 types of perspective. You have deep, flat, limited, and ambiguous. They're all rather self-explanatory. Deep space is going to have a lot of exaggerated depth cues, such as objects in the distance looking smaller, point perspectives, etc. Flat is flat, using a long lens or placing the actor against a wall to make the scene look flat. Limited is a bit trickier. Think about it as multiple flat spaces in one frame. Imagine having a character up against a wall, but there's a window to the side, and the window creates another flat plane within the image. Ambiguous is ambiguous, meaning that the camera is placed in an obscure position, making it difficult to discern exactly where the camera is and what it's looking at. As I said earlier, none of these attributes have a specific definition in terms of what it conveys to the story. It's up to the director to give them definition. For example, maybe there's a character that's extremely shy and reclusive, so they're shot using flat space, up until the end of the story when they finally get out of their shell. It's then we see them in deep space. This highlights another important aspect of the visual motif. When a certain technique is used in a very limited fashion, then not only will it stand out that much more, but it's also the director trying to bring attention to that specific moment. Similar to using the brightness of the subject to make it stand out more, or making the color of the subject stand out from the background. Next is the position of the actors, true blocking, the director's #1 priority. A lot can be interpreted by how the actors are placed. Are they right next to one another? Or are they placed far from one another? Or maybe you have 2 characters, but one is placed higher up than the other. How does this different placement affect the audience's interpretation of the story. More interesting is when their placement changes between shots. For example, let's say two characters are talking, and maybe one character is mad at the other, while the other is trying to apologize and make things right again. We have two medium shots. One is an over-the-shoulder shot in which we see the person apologizing. We can also see the shoulder of the character who is mad in this shot. Perhaps there's hardly even a gap between them. But when we cut to the other angle, it's just a straight medium shot. We don't even see the other apologetic character in this shot. It's just a character who is upset. What does this convey? It shows one character who's trying to make things right and is trying to approach the other character and make a genuine contact, while the other character is being standoffish. They won't even get close to the other person. On top of all this, when you start cutting back and forth between these shots, it really drives home the energy of the scene. That's just one example of blocking, and a rather simple one at that. So next time you're watching a movie, maybe think about not just where the actors are placed, but why they were placed in that specific spot. Not only in relation to the rest of the objects in the frame, but also in relation to the rest of the scene and the entire film. Because everything you see in a movie was a decision made by the director, actors, set designer, cinematographer, etc., either consciously or subconsciously. The last important factor in terms of space is the frame of the picture, and even the frames within the frame. The frame of the picture would be something like aspect ratio. Why is the film 2:1 instead of 16:9? Some films even have multiple aspect ratios in the film itself, such as the Nolan films that cut back and forth from 35mm to IMAX, or even the Amazon Prime show, Homecoming. What's even more interesting than that is frames within frames. Here's a really simple example. Hardly any setup is needed to convey the strength of this technique. Imagine we have a wide shot with two characters in the frame. Now imagine if they're standing in a doorway, or anything really that puts them in a box. It completely changes the style of the shot. Or what about if we only have one of the characters in the doorway? Just by slightly moving the rectangle around, it totally changes the emotional energy of the scene. Also, the overall frame can be divided up in multiple ways, such as straight down the middle to create intense contrast, and very often it is divided into 3 parts using the popular rule of thirds. There's practically an infinite amount of ways to divide the frame. Vertically, horizontally, diagonally, 3 times, 6 times. It can be divided using something like the golden ratio. It can be divided in nice orderly grids, or even chaotic spirals all over the screen. So what does all this division mean? Well, if you have one character who is always accompanied by very grid-like and stern square divisions, and then another who is always surrounded by disorderly divisions, just this simple level of dividing the frame can add a lot to the interpretation of the character. Because if we see recurring motifs with certain characters, then the audience will see those as one and the same. The motif becomes the character, and the character becomes the motif. That's pretty much all I want to discuss in relation to space. Next week, I'll go over line and shape,